Hi, everyone. My name is Alexine Keuroghlian, and I live in Brazil and work on the Peccary project. Um, my partner, you'll see another participant named Wagner Fischer. I've included him because he's really the pig specialist where I work with peccaries. He did his whole PhD just recently on the feral pig and boar issues here in Brazil. So his name is Wagner Fischer, which you'll see there. So I hope everyone is staying home safe. This is my home office situation. I try to contact my co-workers, and they all seem to be doing fine, better than myself actually. So, and this is how it's been. We're crazy to go back into the field, but we're trying to be careful. I'm sure you've heard that Brazil is not doing very well, and but actually the state that I live in central western Brazil does not have a lot of cases compared to the bigger cities like Rio and Sao Paulo. Just a little background. Brazil is composed of numerous different biomes, and the location that I am is here in this yellow blob here, which is what we call the Pantanal region. And I'll go into details, but this region, you'll see the Pantanal really has the influence of what we call the Cerrado um, biome, and also some of the Atlantic forest, which is a very critically endangered area. We also have the Chaco biome influence, which occurs some in Brazil, but with the neighboring countries like Bolivia and Paraguay and even Argentina. And then, of course, the Amazon biome. So we have this influence of numerous biomes in this little blob here, which we call the Pantanal. So just now we're getting up close to the Pantanal, and we call this whole region the Upper Paraguay River Basin. The dark green is the floodplain. It's a basin, and that's about 150,000 square kilometers, and I've put it in miles for those more familiar, not familiar with the metric system. So it's comparable to the state of Illinois in terms of size. And then we have the light green area, which is what we call the highlands. And that's a very large area. And it's the area that has been converted over 60% of it. So it's even though the Pantanal is more conserved, only 20% has been converted. The this lighter green part, which is the highlands, has been converted quite a bit. So the Pantanal is special for numerous reasons, and it's considered a World Biosphere Reserve, and also Ramsar wetland site and an IUCN World Heritage. It's known as one of the largest seasonal tropical wetlands in the world, and the importance of the Pantanal region is internationally recognized. As I mentioned before, 80 to 85% of it is intact, and most of it is on private land. So 95% of it is on private land. So what is happening in the region? There's been a lot of recent harmful land use practices. Land use change is what LUC stands for. And since the 1960s, there's been a rapid wave of agricultural expansion and harmful land use practices. So, the ongoing deforestation, of um, conversion of natural habitat to exotic pasture, just general inefficient use of the land, poor practices and degraded planted areas and crops. And a lot of erosion and just a lot of degradation in general. So the Cerrado region, which is the light green area that we call the highlands of the basin, is really in urgent need of conservation and preservation. And to help also conserve what's left of the Pantanal, the basin. So they're very connected because what happens in the highlands, where most of the water sources come from that drain into the Pantanal, impacts the Pantanal. So when you have deforestation and loss of streams and water sources, it totally disrupts the whole water cycle of the Pantanal. So our priority for the highlands is to maintain and restore the natural vegetation cover, and for the floodplain, just to maintain whatever natural vegetation cover still remains. So hydrological alterations affect the flood pulse of the region, the water balance. And this is one of our main worries, the loss of riparian forests and associated ecosystem services, acceleration of erosion and stream channels, siltations, and just endless poor land use practices. So what do peccaries have to do with all this? And that's where I think the bulk of the talk will start now. um, so we have 3 peccary species, just to give you a little background about this family of organisms or species, which belong to Tayasuidae. And in Brazil, we have these 2, white-lipped and collared peccaries. And you guys in the United States have collared peccaries. So like white-lipped peccaries range from southern Mexico all throughout most of South America. The collared peccary ranges throughout southwestern United States and throughout South America. But then we have the Chacoan peccary, which is endemic to this little region here called the Chaco biome. And it occurs in Bolivia, Paraguay, and Argentina. It did not go into Brazil. And this is considered extremely, the Chacoan peccary is considered critically endangered. The white-lipped peccary is considered vulnerable by the IUCN criteria. So these are the 2 species that we have here in Brazil, the collared peccary and the white-lipped. And the differences between the 2, they're very similar, of course, but there are quite a lot of major differences. One of them being the body mass, of course. White-lipped peccaries are a lot larger than collared peccaries. The herd size, white-lipped peccaries move in big herds. So they can be seen, like you see in the picture above, like in over 100 individuals in a herd, which does not quite happen for collared peccaries. They're in smaller groups. Home range is a lot larger for white-lipped peccaries, ranging to 2,000 to 5,000 hectares or more, and collared peccaries have a much smaller home range. Their main diet is fruits. They're primarily frugivores. And in terms of fragmentation, their response, white-lipped peccaries are much more sensitive just because they need a very large area, a forested area. Yet collared peccaries seem to do pretty well in little, smaller satellite fragments. So as I mentioned, they're both primarily fruit eaters, and they play numerous multiple ecological roles, being fruit dispersers and seed predators. The importance of seed dispersers. But another very important aspect of the white-lipped peccaries is that they represent the largest biomass of mammals in the neotropics. They because we're not talking about a single individual, we're talking about a herd. So there, it's almost equivalent. A herd can be 8,000 kilograms in a herd. So of course that has a pretty strong impact if you think about them moving through the forest, a herd of 50 individuals together moving through the forest is a pretty significant impact. And this movement is considered as this movement of theirs is like, has classified them as ecosystem engineers because they're responsible for the significant soil, litter, and vegetation alterations, which may have cascading effects in most tropical forests. So the act of rooting through soil, clearing, and redistributing the litter, uprooting and trampling little seedlings of several different plant species um, is very important impact in maintaining the biodiversity of the forest and plant species. So they do have this important, they strongly affect forest biodiversity and also through fruit predation and dispersal and through the thinning of the vegetation as they trample through the forest floor. The whole theory of top-down ecological regulation predicts that herbivory suppresses plant abundance biomass and the survival, but increases diversity through the disproportional consumption of dominant species, which inhibits competitive exclusion. So in general, this whole movement and their multiple ecological roles has a very significant impact on the forest structure and diversity. But what happens also when you remove white-lipped peccaries? Other changes also occur. And my colleagues in a study in various fragments in the Atlantic forest have shown that in the absence of white-lipped peccaries, they demonstrated that white-lipped peccaries controlled the rodent seed predation. So because in their absence, rodents either increased in population size due to reduced competition with large mammals or just increased their predation activity. So this one particular rodent, for example, increased like 45%. Oh, I'm sorry, 45%. And it so happens to be the one, a carrier of the hantavirus. So this is also a direct impact on how it can affect the rural community in the area. So the white-lipped peccary's absence in a forest causes rapid cascading effects. I mentioned that they're both seed dispersals and seed predators, and the whole act of seedling trampling and all these different roles have a significant role in maintaining plant diversity. But another interesting study showed how in the Amazon, white-lipped peccaries were considered ecosystem engineers because the wallows they form make the water last into the dry season. So more, let's say this water is maintained more than, let's say, naturally. So according to the researchers, these wallows support reproductive activities for many amphibians and increase their biodiversity in forests. And without peccaries, or in the absence or local extinction of peccaries, the wallow breeding anarans would have not have access to important reproductive habitat. So again, showing how rapid the ecosystem changes when white-lipped peccaries are taken out of the factor. This research was done by Beck et al. And another important, a very important role is that they are the favorite prey for jaguars. And we know that from other studies that jaguars tend to predate upon fewer cattle as they increasingly predate upon peccaries. So when peccaries are absent, we begin to see more human wildlife conflicts, which increases when you lose one of your main prey species. Then you have angry landowners. So just a little bit about how we work with peccaries. People are always curious how you capture them and everything. This is, we use several methods. Small traps, or little pig pens. If I want to capture more than one individual or like 10 or 12, I use the little pig pens. We use natural fruits as baits mixed with corn. And sometimes we're lucky and we get 2 in the little cage and 1 in the huge pig pen. so that's, we get lucky sometimes. And then, of course, we age them and classify them, take biometric, we classify their age category, we take biometrics, body measurements, and we put a chip in them so I know if I have captured them in the past. We also always have a veterinarian that accompanies us, takes blood for genetic work or to evaluate any kind of disease that they might be carrying. And then we fit them with a GPS collar. In the past, of course, we used the VHFs, but we are now more modernized. And this is what it looks like once they have their GPS collar fitted. And just to show, like many people ask me how they behave with collars, and they're quite well. So I'm going to try to show this. Oh, sorry about that. I'm going to try to show you this video clip. Let's see if it'll work. So you saw the one individual passing with the collar. And it works pretty well. I mean, they're quite resistant and easygoing with the collar and the whole process. Oh, I'm sorry. There's something. It doesn't. I'm having a little trouble with my fly-ins and the presentation. Anyway, so this particular slide is supposed to show that here. Is showing that. Can we pause? So peccaries are known to range in all types of forest types, but they require continuous tracts of forest. They and large, undisturbed forest is essential for maintaining viable populations. And this has been documented by numerous researchers. It is not unknown that they require very pristine forest cover, and also they're closely associated to riparian zones. But so what happens when you're in this kind of situation where the landscape becomes fragmented? Well, some of the radio telemetry studies have shown us that in the Pantanal, which is fairly preserved, where where deforestation occurred, the peccary herd home range was considerably larger compared to an area more pristine and intact. So, okay, so now we know that they do respond to deforestation. They do not use open area, and they adapted their range use to avoid that area that's deforested, because it seems it's pretty logical, since they are primarily fruit eaters, that most of their food is in forested areas. So in the highlands, where 60%, there's a 60% of vegetation loss, we expect for them to respond negatively to deforestation. And very little is known about how white-lipped peccaries respond in agricultural lands, and how they respond to the remaining fragments, as you see in this scenario here. All these red points are GPS localizations in the highlands of the Pantanal. So we examined this in numerous herds, and numerous results came out of this. But just to give you the bottom line, there was a very significant relationship between range size and the number of fruiting species that were occurring. And how do we know that? Is because we do fruit census every month and for over numerous years, since their movement is going to be so closely associated to the resources. This is something we've always done parallel in all the study sites that we've worked. But what's interesting is that it's not that clear cut. What we've learned is that there were differences in range size between the different herds, depending on the amount of vegetation cover. But also in the wet season, for example, herds occupying areas with less than 40% native forest cover showed monthly ranges twice as large as the herds occupying areas with, let's say, more than 60% of forest cover. And this is interesting because, like I said, each of all these, the data and the results will change according to how much vegetation cover and connectivity between fragments actually occurs. So it becomes, now we're getting a little complicated, because we're not dealing with groups now that are in this wonderfully 100% vegetation cover. Now we're dealing with a complicated landscape, and each scenario is showing different results. And another thing we looked at is that, okay, what about these fragmented areas? You know, what are we looking at? What kind of model or movement do they follow? So, for example, A over here, so this is what we tested and trying to understand, okay, so how is their movement in a fragmented landscape? So A would be forests that are essential for white-lipped peccaries' daily activities, such as food and shelter, you know, but they easily cross the matrix habitat. Say they go to this fragment, this fragment, this fragment, and they walk through the open areas. So B would be, you know, them just using the fragment and not going to these fragments at all, because there's too much open area. So, and then C, of course, they would just use both, you know, easily through the matrix and then the fragment. Forest is not essential for either food, shelter, or displacement. So what did we find? What we found was that the choice of movement was through the forest connectivity, where there's a connection. Herds were found in the largest, most connected forest fragments, and there was selection for both forest cover and connectivity. We also worked with camera traps. We used camera trap records for as conservation features, and producing as part of a systematic conservation plan for the municipality with the intention of creating a conservation plan on the municipal level. So based on camera trap results, just to give you, we used, 177 camera traps, and was numerous different fragment size from 10 to 25,000 hectares. And we connected it with, I'm sorry. So it also included their interaction with other frugivore species, large bird frugivores, the carousel here, this one, and then other mammals and even carnivores, because numerous, this is a tyra that's related to otters, for example. They are fruit eaters as well. So this gave us the opportunity to see their presence and absence in fragments with and without peccaries and the whole frugivore community. So looking at these different features, what we've discovered was that for white-lipped peccaries, using the predicting areas that were not sampled, there were no additional fragments that they would occur. So the pink ones were areas that were sampled and there were no peccaries. The dark green is where peccaries occurred, and the gray is where they were not sampled. Using the model, we learned that they would not occur any other fragments in this particular municipality. And they were basically absent in any fragment that was less than 2,300 hectares. But for example, for tapirs, as you guys know, one of our largest mammals, they use smaller home ranges, and they occurred in numerous new areas here where presence predicted. And the same for collared peccaries. So really, only the white-lipped peccaries were restricted to larger, more intact fragment sizes. So again, indicating that they are important bioindicators for this, for a conservation land use planning exercise. So here is again another area with showing the satellite points of one of our peccaries, and again showing the importance of rare habitats and riparian zones. And this is what it would look like, if you took the points out and how they move. And you can see how they just use these corridors. Most of these have streams because by law, the landowner is supposed to leave these areas intact. Our results indicate that even in a highly fragmented landscape, white-lipped peccaries continue to seek forests to move across patches and use their preferred habitats. And furthermore, the non-random use occurs in a hierarchical pattern where herds home ranges within the landscape occurring within well-connected forests, whereas within their home range, herds predominantly select forest cover. So how can we use peccaries' movements and choice of corridors in a fragmented landscape and for conservation purposes? Well, one of them would be to restore corridors between different fragments and ensure that landowners, because they're allowed to, by law, they need to leave 20% of their land with vegetation cover. So try to promote where they leave their vegetation cover intact and possibly restore corridors where fragments are disconnected. And we're obviously with that, you benefit numerous other species. And also it's a win-win situation for the rural community. It restores degraded areas, improving soil and water quality. So again, the question now back to why the white-lipped peccaries, because really they do identify ecological corridors for wildlife, and they are important bio indicators of intact forest. So when you go to an area and you know that white-lipped peccaries have become locally extinct, you know that something is going to happen very quickly to that environment. So kind of like a recapitulation, white-lipped peccaries use large home ranges. Just to go over a little bit what we discussed, they use a diversity of habitats. They have large herds, very strong impact on ecosystem structure and function, and they're vulnerable to environmental threats and one of the first to disappear. So they're quite sensitive. So they turn out to be a very important umbrella species. However, the continued threats have been, we mentioned these before, of course, they affect white-lipped peccaries. And here is the Pantanal Basin. And you can see that the landscape is already naturally fragmented because it's filled with lakes and water, habitats, aquatic habitats, and then these strings of forest. So when you take out these strings of forest and cause this fragmented situation, we often encounter local extinctions just because the fragment is too small and there's not enough habitat diversity. So they move on. Another threat is illegal hunting and poaching. In Brazil, there is no hunting of native wildlife. So, of course, it happens anyway, the poaching. And with no control of what's being removed, it proves to be a serious impact on peccary populations. Even the decline of white-lipped peccaries affect, as I mentioned earlier, affect jaguars and other species, and increase, of course, the whole human and wildlife conflict that occurs. But the worrying part is that numerous conservation units, national parks, have lost white-lipped peccaries. So even in protected areas, we're seeing a lot of local extinctions because of illegal hunting that occurs around the park or even in the park. Fire is another serious problem where you can eliminate a whole herd of peccaries very quickly, and again causing local extinction. And another problem is in the occurring, I have to say now, is climate change. Prediction is for overall drier conditions with a 35 to 45% decrease in rainfall for this region. And for a species that depends on a resource that is very closely tied to rainfall, this will have serious consequences. What are our other threats? Well, here we go, feral pigs. Now we get into the pig part. And you can see this pig doesn't look very well. And they are in the Pantanal, in the basin, we call them feral pigs and not the European boar, which are different, same species, different, right? Different race. So they are quite adapted to the Pantanal basin habitat. Remembering the basin, that dark green in the map, and the highlands, the lighter green. So they've been in the Pantanal basin for over 200 years. And just to remind everyone, I'm sure you guys all know, is that the native species in the Western Hemisphere are the 3 peccary species that I talked about earlier, right? And in the Eastern Hemisphere is where you have the numerous, over 17 species of pigs belonging to the Suidae. these two families separated over 30 million years ago. So they are a lot of very different features. And they're quite different in so many ways. However, they often look alike, you know. So here are feral pigs in the Pantanal. They're very adapted to the whole habitat. Of course, they love all the water and aquatic ecosystems in the region. And this is what the Pantanal looks like. I told you how it's naturally fragmented because there's all these open grasslands that are flooded in the wet season and then they start drying. And it's ideal habitat for feral pigs. They love it. So when we look at camera traps, they're often sharing the fruits resources with the native species. And if you look at the times, you can see here's white-lipped peccaries going through eating a fruit resource. It's 5:49 p.m. Same place, 6:31, and this is a feral pig. And again here, this was 7:44 a.m. and this is about 15 minutes later. Feral pigs. So they do overlap completely in terms of habitat use in the Pantanal area. And we have studied feral pigs, you know, because the big thing was, you know, what are their impacts on native species and niche overlap, et cetera. So numerous studies, not only by other colleagues as well, looked into this, you know, looked into scat analysis and the whole overlap in fruit resources and taxonomic identification of food items in scat samples were done. And basically the bottom line is that there are differences, but overlap in food resources is higher between the native peccaries compared to the pigs. And the big thing was the number and diversity of fruit species encountered in the fecal samples were higher for peccaries compared to feral pigs. So feral pigs would eat the same fruits, just not the same diversity because feral pigs' diet is much more varied. And then also we looked into camera traps studies to see, you know, what was going on there. And in terms of how they foraging, looking at feeding bouts, and we put camera traps under 37 different fruiting trees. And it did show some overlap between white-lipped peccaries and feral pigs, suggesting that they can potentially compete for similar fruits when resources are limited, let's say in the dry season. So there's numerous different analyses with camera traps or species, basically showing, yeah, there is overlap, but how serious is it? And could it be serious? So that it's kind of wishy-washy in that sense. But there is overlap. And what about in terms of how they use their area? So in terms of time budgets, we found that feral pigs may influence the foraging period of both native peccary species, but in different ways. Like in the absence of feral pigs, for example, collared peccary activity peaks, let's say in the early evening, possibly avoiding not only feral pigs, but white-lipped peccaries too, which is white-lipped peccary is definitely the more dominant species. So in the presence of feral pigs, collared peccaries would forage more in the morning. So there were impacts, let's say, in their time budgets. But also in terms of seed predator, as I mentioned, peccaries are seed predators and dispersers, but the feral pigs are primarily fruit dispersers. So that's when numerous scientists say, well, look, you know, they're good for the environment and vegetation because they disperse seeds too. So there was numerous arguments about that, and other people have looked into examine the benefits of cattle and pigs foraging in the Pantanal forest as potential contribution to seed dispersal. And of special interest of is the dispersal of large seeds that fewer present day native frugivores are unable to swallow whole. So many argue that the pigs and the cows kind of fulfill that role. So maybe they're friends, right? And another interesting find was that in the Pantanal, we learned that feral pig hunting is a big deal. And one of the aspects of the traditional activity in the Pantanal is the harvest of previously castrated male feral pigs. And hunters estimated that it takes like up to 6 to 10 months after they castrate it for the animal to heal and fatten up. And then they go after them to hunt. And they identify it because when they castrate them, they'll cut their tail or mark their ears. And then when they encounter them in their day-to-day activities, they'll hunt them down. So when we did some surveys, we realized one thing we learned was that really what was hunted were primarily feral pigs, and very little white-lipped peccaries, and even less collared peccaries. So they were diluting the hunting impact on native species. And the socioeconomic impact of feral pigs is very important in the Pantanal because the meat is highly valued and the fat they use as preservatives. So it saves for it's a financial economic incentive for the locals, and it's just very important in general for the local Pantanal inhabitants. But people do prefer to harvest feral pigs in the Pantanal, but hunting is important to decrease the impact of feral pigs in the landscape. But now, with the introduction of electricity and freezers, the amount of hunting has reduced quite a bit. So this is a worry because the increase in the feral pig population is, of course, happening because most of the cowboys, when we were interviewing them, told us that they would rather spend their day doing other things, their day off doing other activities like maybe fishing or working with the leather, and not going back on a horse like they do all week long and hunt for feral pigs. So it's less of an incentive. And most landowners do provide meat, cow meat, to the cowboys for free. So it has even become less of an incentive to hunt feral pigs. So that the ecological impact of feral pigs is still poorly understood, but we can answer, does the buffering from hunting that feral pigs provide to native wildlife outweigh the negative impacts of the species on potential resource competition, habitat degradation, or even disease transmission is still a big question mark. And I think that there is an impact, and there will be more of an impact in the very near future, because these are so we talked a lot about the feral pigs in the Pantanal that have been here for 200 or plus years, but this is what's happening more recently is the widespread presence of the wild boar in this area. So now we have the dangers of having the boar-pig hybrids, which is commonly happening now in the Pantanal Basin. So the orange dots indicate the hybrids and boars around the Pantanal. The green represents the Pantanal where feral pigs occur. So with the growing boar populations in the south and now our region, central western Brazil, boar hunting has become prevalent in this area. It was permitted in 2013. However, it did not include the feral pigs because the environmental agencies consider the feral pigs like a naturalized species. So it's a bit confusing because I'll tell you, these hybrids are very hard to differentiate, you know? Yeah, these mixtures, where do you draw the line? So it's, so that part is a bit iffy and not very clear. In the year 2000, all of the Pantanal had about 35,000 feral pigs. This was a census done back in the year 2000 by these authors, Moron et al. And more recently, Wagner, who did a whole new evaluation, had calculated that today there's at least 50,000 boars in just the southern Pantanal, which is, let's say, half. So 35,000 would be in an area of 150,000 square kilometers. And 50,000, he calculated, in an area of 75,000. So it's increased a lot. And so, of course, in the highlands where the corn crop has become more prevalent in numerous areas, a lot of conversion of pasture to corn and soya crops. There's been an increase, of course, in this whole human-wildlife conflict, and people have been wanting to get rid of the European boars, and legally they can. This is in the highlands area. And now it's like new businesses have evolved just to get rid of the boar populations that are invading the crops and are problematic in numerous regions, of course. But a huge concern is the confusion locals make between boars and peccaries. This is an example of a news source talking about the permission of hunting boars, but they're showing a picture of white-lipped peccaries. So this is a huge concern because many people will allocate, these are feral pigs in the Pantanal, and these are peccaries. So people will often confuse them. And as I mentioned before, hunting here is illegal. So we had to come up with something to help reduce this conflict between boars and peccaries and people not understanding the difference. So we came up, showing, the different, this is white lip, this is collared peccary, these are pigs, and these are exotics, these are native, these are native. So this was kind of widely distributed everywhere. I'm not sure how much it helped. But again, talking about boars and feral pigs and their impact on native wildlife, it's just this. We see a lot of sick individuals, feral pigs. And then we found that population density of the vampire bats is usually high in areas with domestic animals, especially cattle. And with the land use change, converting areas of natural ecosystems into pasture or livestock, this may have boosted the vampire bat populations. However, conversion of pasture into sugarcane, for example, in the southern part of Brazil, and most southeastern Brazil during the past few decades, the severe defaunation of the Atlantic forest may have forced the bats to switch from formerly abundant cattle to the alternative food source, such as feral pigs or boars. So in the Pantanal, where cattle density can, let's say, reach like 1.4 head per hectares, the vampire bat is the seventh most abundant bat. Whereas in the Atlantic forest, they represent less than 1% of the captures. So the growing population of feral pigs in the Atlantic forest region makes them ideal prey substitutes for the bats, as pigs are among the preferred prey of this species. So basically, the increase causing potential vampire bat populations to increase due to the widespread invasion of feral pigs, mostly in Brazil's southern regions. So this is another huge concern in general. Now, not only in the Atlantic forest, but it was strongly documented, but now in the whole Pantanal region as well. So again, the big question comes up, friends or foes? I'm afraid to say definitely foes, in my opinion. and this is how I end my talk. So I thank all my collaborators, and I want to thank you guys for inviting me, and I hope it was useful. That's it.